How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and this is my channel all about PlayStation. It's called PSReady. So if you want to keep up to date on all the latest PlayStation news, like literally everything, make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications set to all. I've been pumping these subscriber callouts at the beginning of the videos because I really want to hit 200,000 subs by spring, and 90% of my viewers don't subscribe to the channel. So if you enjoy these videos, help me out by subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. In today's video, we have an extremely exciting single topic to talk about, and that is a new PlayStation handheld that is not the Portal. It is a new handheld that can actually run games on the device, which you guys know. If you watch the channel since I started it, I have been begging in so many videos for Sony to make a new handheld, and it looks like it's finally happening because this leak isn't from like a Chinese forum. It isn't from a tweet. This one is coming from Moore's Law is Dead, and this dude's track record when it comes to guessing hardware is as close to ironclad as you can get. I know there are leaks out there that don't come true because up until something is announced, and sometimes even after something is announced, Sony always has the right to pull the plug. Like, we just heard a news story about Dreams, the platform game that Media Molecule made. They allegedly had a PS5 and PC port done of this game engine, but because of the layoffs at Media Molecule, it was canceled before it was even announced. So that can always happen, but these rumors are just so good that I fully believe this will come true. So we should definitely start out with the specs of this handheld. It should come as no surprise that Sony for this thing is going to partner up with AMD. That's not a surprise because with the PS5, the Xbox Series X, even the Steam Deck, they are the partner that all of these gaming platform companies go to when they're developing hardware. And because of the whole philosophy around this handheld, which I'll talk about in a minute, it makes sense that basically what they want to do is have it use a shrink down PS5 chip. Right now, Sony is in the high level design phase, which means that this thing is probably 2 or 3 years away, which lines up pretty much perfectly with when these things have been released in the past, like towards the middle or end of a generation. The PSP came out right in the middle of the PS2 generation, and the PS Vita came out right at the tail end of the PS3 and lasted right into the middle of the PS4 generation. Like, Sony, they really hit their peak with the Vita right in the middle of the PS4 generation. Like, when you would get PS Plus games like Hotline Miami 2 or Titan Souls or any of these games, they would give you cross-buy, which basically meant that you got the game on Vita as well, and your save would transfer over the cloud, and it was awesome. Games like Helldivers, games like Titan Souls, Hotline Miami 2, all of those games had save transferring, and I absolutely loved it. And that save transferring went all the way back to the PS3 with games like Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. When they eventually released Peace Walker HD on the PS3, you could plug your Vita into the PS3 and transfer your save back and forth, and that was like the time to be alive. Obviously, as the games got more advanced and they stopped coming out on Vita, that save transferring feature went kind of by the wayside. But with Sony's new vision in making everything be built around the PlayStation ecosystem, obviously that is an extremely high level goal for any new handheld they make, which is just perfect. It's music to my ears. So this new handheld APU is going to be definitely downclocked for reasons I'll talk about in a second, but it's not going to be any slouch either. It's going to have 18 CUs of power, which is great for an APU, and as for clock speeds, it's going to be running at around 1.8 gigahertz, which is definitely downclocked, but good enough for what this thing is trying to do. It's basically being built to run PS4 and PS5 games. And the coolest thing about predicting what this handheld will be is that we have handhelds out right now that are very similar to what I think a PlayStation handheld will try to do. If you look at the Steam Deck and you look at the ROG Ally or the Legion Go, they're all really sitting in the same realm, and they're all kind of going for different goals, which is funny because if you ask me, the Steam Deck is basically the perfect handheld right now. So as for what type of screen Sony could pack into a potential Vita 2, I would guess that it will be bigger, obviously, than what we had in the Vita, which I think was like a 5-inch screen, and it ran at around 560p. If you look at the Steam Deck, it's a modest 800p, which, like, when you hear that, it's obviously not the highest resolution screen, but I can tell you firsthand that at around 7 inches, 800p looks absolutely fine. You don't see the pixels really at all, and when you're playing on an OLED panel, it looks absolutely phenomenal. I've talked about on the channel quite a bit about how, for me, someone who plays on PC PC and PlayStation 5, the Portal really has no use because the Steam Deck gives me so many more opportunities to play the games I'm already playing, and I can stream from my PlayStation 5 and I'll get a better experience. Like, the DualSense features on the Portal are great. I absolutely love that aspect of the handheld, but being able to stream from my PS5 with less latency and be able to take advantage of HDR and get an OLED screen, that's like the best thing I could ever ask for, and I care way more about that than haptic feedback or adaptive triggers. But with a PlayStation handheld that's coming in the future that's fully expected to use DualSense technology and be able to play these games, it's kind of like the best of both worlds. For some reason, a lot of these manufacturers like Nintendo, Valve, Asus, and Lenovo, they love to have an LCD model be the first generation, and then around halfway through, they'll release an updated model that has an OLED. But Sony, their whole philosophy has been built around getting out of the mass market and more into the premium market, where they want to have the best possible technology in your hands and in developers' hands. So I would fully expect this thing to probably have around a 7 to 8 inch screen just to keep it able to fit in your backpack. But also, I would bet that out of the gate, it will use an OLED panel, because the Vita original, like the original Vita that came out, it used an OLED panel, and weirdly, they flip-flopped it. When they released the revision on the Vita, that was the Vita Slim, they went to an LCD panel, which, while it looked really good, was nowhere near as good as the original Vita's OLED. And the cool thing about a handheld like this is, while you have to skimp a little bit on the actual resolution to get the performance you want, you don't have to skimp on the frame rate of the screen, or the hertz of the screen, the refresh rate, whatever you want to call it. And thinking about the technology of a screen in a next generation Vita, I would guess that this thing will probably copy the Steam Deck OLED and have a 90 hertz panel. Now, on the surface, you're probably sitting there saying, why would you want a 90 hertz panel? The only games that you're going to be able to run at 90 hertz are side scrollers or indie games like Rogue Legacy 2, Dead Cells, Castlevania Advanced Collection. But the reason you would want a 90 hertz panel is because if you're playing games that are bigger, like God of War Ragnarok or Ghost of Tsushima or Death Stranding 2, is because even if you're playing them at a target of 30 FPS, the screen is still going to run at 90 hertz because 30 divides perfectly evenly into 90, and that will make everything look and feel a whole lot smoother. I didn't really want to play games at 30 FPS on the original Steam Deck, but once I got the OLED, that made me want to play a lot more AAA games, even from the newer generation, because with that 90 hertz panel, even running at 30 FPS, the games look incredibly smooth. And I don't think I need to remind you that every game right now is trying to run at 30 FPS on the PS5 anyway, even though there's headroom to run at 40 or 50 or 60 FPS. They just don't want to wait long enough to get the game optimized to the point where they could run it at 60 FPS. So with the headroom already there, you could see a future where you have parity, in the sense that not necessarily like the games are going to look as good on the handheld, but they're going to run around exactly the same, which is great. But then when you're talking about games like Dave the Diver, or older games like Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, or even Uncharted Golden Abyss, you can not only run those at a higher resolution to match the new handheld screen, but you could also run them at a higher frame rate, like 60 or even up to 90. And the coolest thing about a screen like this is you can set the hertz of the actual screen. So while it caps out at 90, if you set it to run a game at 40 FPS, which looks phenomenal and actually feels very similar to 60 FPS, you can actually drop the hertz of the screen down to 80, so you're not going to get weird frame pacing. It's like the best technology ever. And like I mentioned a minute ago, one of the biggest features this new handheld will bring along is the ability to carry over DualSense features. So you'll get the adaptive triggers, you'll get the haptic feedback, you'll get maybe a light bar of some sort, just so you can play all of the PS5 games you're already used to on the go, and the experience will be just as good on this handheld as it is on your PlayStation 5, just in a handheld form. So it's basically the best of both worlds, and that's the future that I think Sony really sees here. And another huge reason why they would want to downclock the chip so much is mainly because of that haptic feedback, the adaptive triggers, and this OLED panel. All of that stuff sucks battery life like crazy. So when you're running a chip at a lower clock, you use less battery, and that stops you from making a device that's super thick. This handheld is a great example. It's called the Ioneo Slide. I actually think it's pretty cool because it has the T-Mobile Sidekick action where you can slide the screen up and get a full-on keyboard, which is great for using Windows, but it looks awesome from this angle, right? Like, it looks essentially like a Switch Lite or something like that, because they basically just clone the Switch Lite's chassis. But then when you turn it on its side, it's extremely thick. And the reason for that is this thing uses a full-on laptop chip inside of it. It's like an AMD 7840U. And when you're running that thing at full power, you need a big ass battery in here. You need a big ass heatsink to keep that thing cool, and even that isn't really good enough. If you're playing a AAA game on this thing like Baldur's Gate 3, it overheats extremely quick and starts slowing down. But if Sony is running the chip at 1.8 gigahertz, it's never really going to heat up to the point where it's going to drain battery life at a rapid rate. And that's really what you get out of a console maker actually making a handheld that's built to run their own games. That puts it well above the Steam Deck, which has to be made to run everything from God of War all the way down to like Super Mario World if you're emulating the Super Nintendo on it or something like that. And going back to the screen, I definitely think 800p is 100% the sweet spot on something like this, because I have a bunch of handhelds. I just showed you the Ayaneo Slide, but I also have the Legion Go and the ROG Ally. The Legion Go has a 1600p screen and it's 8 inches, and the ROG Ally has a 1200p screen that's around 7 inches. And while it is really cool and crisp looking on the actual handheld, you're never playing games at the full resolution. Basically what it does is it runs games at 800p and then uses AMD's RIS, which is like image sharpening, to upscale it to the full 1200 or 1600p. And that looks pretty good, but it still looks better on the screen of the Steam Deck because you can run the games natively at 800p. And even with upscaling, AMD is not the best at that. So without upscaling, it looks way better. So if you are initially worried about a screen being low resolution in a handheld like this, there's really no reason to be, because you're going to get better battery life and you're going to get largely a crisper image, even though the actual pixel count is lower, which is great. So from a hardware perspective, I think Sony is poised here to really stand out in this ever expanding field of handheld PCs, because they have the killer feature, which is of course the DualSense features like the haptic feedback and the adaptive triggers. But where they're really going to win, I think, is with the games that they can offer. Think back to consoles like the PSP, the PS Vita, and the 3DS, right? Like back in the day for those handhelds, they had dedicated games. On the PSP, you had stuff like Daxter, which was a full spin-off game of Jak and Daxter. You had Secret Agent Clank. You had a full-on Ratchet and Clank game called Size Matters, but when you compare that to the PS2 version, it was definitely pared down. Same goes for God of War. You had Chains of Olympus and Ghosts of Sparta, and those were definitely scaled down versions of their PS2 counterparts, which was great. The problem is they had to have their studios that were already making full-on PS2 or PS3 games split off teams and make these handheld games, and it got to the point where you had to get more and more sales to recoup the budgets. And that is especially true when you got to the PS Vita, where the goal was having PS3 level graphics on the go, but they were still trying to make dedicated handheld games like Tearaway, Killzone Liberation, Uncharted Golden Abyss, and everything kind of converged where it was like, why are we spending so much money to make these dedicated handheld games if the ultimate goal is to get them to run like a PS3 anyway? Why wouldn't we just port down the PS3 games? And they kind of hit a wall where they said, we can't get PS3 games running at an acceptable level on this thing, and they kind of just let it go. I think Nintendo kind of got to the same conclusion, which is why for the generation after the Wii U, instead of having a handheld console that had handheld games and a full-on console that had console games, they merged them to be one, and they basically just had a handheld you could take on the go and then dock into your TV. And that gave them the opportunity to charge $60 for every game across the board. So when you had Breath of the Wild, you'd pay $60 for it. Or when you had a handheld style game like Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, they could still charge $60 for it because it was only for one platform. So when you're thinking about Sony's new philosophy, which is to get everyone playing PlayStation 5 games in as many places as possible, the ultimate goal that Sony has for this thing is 100% not going to be taking your new PlayStation handheld games that are totally different on the go. The goal is 100% going to be taking your PlayStation 5 games on the go, having your saves, having your PlayStation Network login, having everything that you have on your PlayStation 5, but you can play it on a plane or at a hotel or in the car when you're not at your house and can't plug in your PlayStation 5 to a TV. Part of me is a little bit bummed out because when I was growing up, it was so awesome having these separate handheld games like Pokemon, Chains of Olympus, Ghosts of Sparta, Peace Walker, like all these awesome handheld games. And I think we will still get those because it will still open up that opportunity to make games that are like oriented to be taken on the go. But it really is much better on the Steam Deck being able to take games that I already play on my TV on my Steam Deck in bed and still carry my progress over. Like right now, I play SnowRunner all the time on my racing wheel on my PC, and then I start to get a little bit tired. Like I don't want to use the gas pedal. I don't want to keep using the steering wheel right around 11 o'clock, but then I can play from 11 to 1 in bed and just have everything transfer over, and I can play the game at the exact same settings, basically maxed out, but keep the frame rate at around 30 FPS and everything works just fine. And it's also an incredibly great counter to what we've been seeing lately with game budgets totally exploding exploding. We've heard this time and time again. We've seen all these thousands of layoffs happening, and what the reasoning for that is because games like Spider-Man 2 cost $300 million, which is on par or more than like Avengers Endgame. And when you're spending that much on a game, you need to sell millions and millions, like tens of millions of copies of these games to actually recoup the budget and then start making a profit. So if you have a handheld that can run the same games, you immediately open up a new audience of people that only have this handheld but know they can have these games, and then if they eventually get a PlayStation 5, they can continue on where they left off, or vice versa. If they already have a PlayStation 5 and pick up this handheld, they can continue on exactly where they left off, and that encourages people to buy games on PlayStation versus Steam or the Xbox store. And of course, that also plays into this future that's already rapidly approaching where we're not going to have physical discs. Like, look, I see the writing on the wall. I love collecting physical games. I mostly collect Switch games physically because I love having the little cartridges. They're all down there on the shelf behind me. I've definitely started collecting PS5 games less and less as time has gone on, right? Like, I download games on my PlayStation 5 upstairs so I can download them down here on my PS5 Slim. And that convenience factor is just so good that it's kind of eliminated my strong desire I've had for my entire life to go to Best Buy or go to GameStop or Target on day one of a game's release to pick these games up, because the convenience factor of being able to download my games from my PlayStation account wherever, whenever I want, and have them in the account forever kind of eclipsed the want to actually go pick up these physical games. And if you don't believe this is happening, go to your local Target right now and look at the Xbox section when it comes to games. There is virtually nothing there. There's probably 2 or 3 games at any given time that you can even buy physically for Xbox. And if you turn around and look at the PlayStation section, which is right across the aisle, there are less and less games every day there as well, because it's becoming less and less enticing for these publishers to actually produce physical games, because if you buy it digitally, then if they ever run out of licensing agreements, they can just take it away whenever they want, which is ultimately what they've always wanted, which sucks, but like, it's already happening. So I feel like we just got to get used to it. So when you look at this all digital future that's basically already here, I don't think Sony's ever been in a better spot to release a handheld, right? Like, they've always struggled in the handheld market because of the whole system that they had, where people basically said, why would I want a pared down version of God of War or Grand Theft Auto or Metal Gear Solid that I can take on the go? I'd rather just play on my TV. Well, now you're just going to be playing the same games, and that makes this thing totally open to be able to be bought by PlayStation fans. The one thing that I think could really hurt this thing out of the gate, though, is the same thing that hurt both the PSP and the PS Vita, and that's proprietary memory. Both of those handhelds did not have enough memory on the actual handheld to actually store any games or store even your saves. So what you had to do with the Vita specifically was pay for these memory cards, which the pricing on them was totally out of whack. Like, you would pay over $150 for, I think, like a 64 gigabyte memory card for the Vita, and that killed everyone's excitement right out of the gate, because not only do you have to buy the console for like $250, you also have to spend at least $100 on a memory card, and then after that you're spending $40 on games. By having a console that has enough onboard storage to store your saves, but then could use micro SD like the Steam Deck and the Nintendo Switch, those are cheap as hell now, and that could totally eliminate that bottleneck that they had in the past. I know Sony's been resistant to put out a new handheld mainly because of hacking. That was something that plagued them on both the PSP and the Vita, but the more online kind of creeps its way into every game we play, the less I think they have to worry about piracy on these handhelds. Like, if you have an online only feature in a game, you can't really play a pirated version of it, because once you connect to the PlayStation Network, Sony has a great way of finding out, and then they could just ban your PlayStation account as a whole. So that entices people less and less to pirate games on handhelds. But if you really want to have emulation, you want to play cracked games, you want to play games on the Epic Game Store, the Xbox Game Pass app, or Steam, you still have a bigger option ready to go at any given time with the Steam Deck. So Sony can just slot right in there and say, hey, if you want hardcore PlayStation 5 games that you can take on the go and have your saves transfer, we have the handheld right here and it's ready to go. So yeah, when it comes to a new PSP, new Vita, whatever you want to call it, I think this will 100% happen. I knew something was happening behind the scenes. We've heard rumors about it from a bunch of different people, but now that we have a full spec list of what they want it to run, what kind of chip they want it to have in it, what kind of gigahertz it's going to run at, I have never believed more than I do now that this will actually happen. And the idea of getting this thing in the next couple of years, it's going to make the next couple of years go extremely slow. I really hope we start to hear more and more rumors of something like this happening, because every rumor about Sony working on a new handheld, whether it's the Portal 2 or a PSP 2, it always gets me excited, because out of all the handhelds I've ever owned. The Steam Deck definitely gives the Vita a run for its money, but the Vita is 100% my favorite handheld of all time. So yeah, what do you think? Would you take a PlayStation handheld on the go if you could play PS1 games, PS2 games, PS3, PS Vita, PS4, and PS5 games all in your hand? I totally would, but I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. Remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend and shape on.